Welcome, book lovers, back to our book club. We have Phil Svitek and myself, Marisa Serafini. This month, for the month of March 2025, we're reading Confessions of a 40-something fuck-up, written by Alexandra Potter. Alexandra Potter. I was excited to read this because, admittedly, I watched the TV show first, and then I was like really taken aback by that show and how good it was. I was like, of course, it's based on a book, so let's read it. And here we are talking about it. Phil, what were your quick thoughts of it?
Yeah, I mean, I am a fan of these types of books overall. Something not necessarily easy breezy, but something that you can engage with on an easy level, and it has its depths and whatnot. But at the same time, yeah, it's just an enjoyable thing, right? And so we've done like in 5 years and things of that nature, right? So not quite the same, but you kind of know what you're going to get, and I think there's value to that, right? Like, you know as the title implies, she starts off in a bad place, and as you might expect, by the end, life's kind of okay. How it gets there is different, and so it really is the journey. And you know whether you're a 40-year-old, a 30-year-old, 20-year-old, maybe a 50-year-old, it doesn't really matter, guy, girl. I think we all need inspiration of this kind, just to be like, okay, I'm not the only one. And that's
Right.
a portion of that book ends up being about that, of like, oh, maybe I'm not the only fuck up in the world. And so
Right.
yeah, enjoyable book.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think that that's the thing that what hooked me on the show, Not Dead Yet, is that I know, like, I don't want to keep comparing, but, like, just quickly, it's like the comparison, of the show, it's like it's actually, like, a 30-something-year-old woman, which I am a 30-something-year-old woman, so I resonated with the character a lot in that, and she was a character who, like, just got out of a relationship, had to move back, had to, like, start a new job, kinda, quote, unquote, "all over again," but start at the bottom than where she was, and so it's like it's kinda like just starting over, um, that whole sense of like, "Oh, man, I should be farther along in my life than I should be," and we're not the only people who think that, especially, like, at a certain age. I don't know, society, like, puts this pressure on us. It's like, "Oh, by this age, you're supposed to have a house, you're supposed to have kids, you're supposed to be married, blah, 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 blah." That's a very conditioned way of the American life, just, like, life in general, and, especially culturally here, and I don't know, that resonated with me because being a 30-something-year-old woman who doesn't have any of that, I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm totally this woman. This woman's my life," and, like, but I also know a lot of men who are also in that same position too, and then when I found out it was actually the book's called 40-something fuck up, it really does show that it's not about age, it's just about how you view life and how you go through life, depending on where you think you're successful, where you're not, where you're lacking, what you have, what you don't. And, I think that's a overall universal theme that a lot of us can resonate with.
Yeah, sadly it is. And to a degree, it is gendered in the sense that the main character is named Nell, and for her, there's a time clock in terms of being able to have a kid, right? Unless, of course, you freeze your eggs, but that's costly, and that's made mention of. So there's that component for women. Um, but at the same time, I mean, whether society or otherwise, you would think it, it's just one of those things that society overall kind of lets us down, and you think you do everything right. And yeah, I think especially by the time you're 40, it's like, I want to start to live a more comfortable life. It's like your 20s and your 30s, you know there's that idea that you grind, and eventually that will pay off, right? Like, you do the hard work, so that way, whatever, you get the mansion or the white picket fence, whatever it is, right? So
Mhm.
you make those sacrifices in hopes of something, and when that becomes a falsity, therein lies the disconnect. And she thought she had done those certain things in the right way. And we'll talk about the sort of big spoiler, because basically the catalyst for all of it, is she was set to be married, then essentially decided not to, lived in California, moved back home to England, and not quite literally living in her parents' basement, but at the doorstep of the basement, so to speak. And we'll talk
Right.
about like the dynamic of that because obviously, how she had to live plays a large role in that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved how you kind of went into that because, yes, like the our main character now, failed relationships. I feel at this point we've all had at least one or two, so we kind of know the pain of heartbreak and separation, the pain of moving. I've personally have definitely moved like 4 times in the last 5 years. It's insane. So like that's always a stressful thing, but also like you touched upon it earlier, just like we're conditioned to think that, like, in our 40s, in our 50s, we should, quote, unquote, being the operative word, should be more stable in life financially, emotionally, with family, like, you should have, like, a better sense of who you are and, like, what you do in life, and then to have all these things, like, fall apart for her in her 40s, like, yeah, that causes a lot of instability, and that's where she's questioning her life. And I feel like when you have life stresses like that, that's where you really kind of do have your quote unquote midlife crisis. That's where you question everything. Like, did I do this right? Should I have done this instead? What can I do now to make me feel better? And we get into that. So Nell's she was a writer and former journalist, and but because she's been out of the writing game for a while, she gets her a job writing obituaries, which is like a very humbling thing. And it feels like even if you think about it, like her job is to write an overall character study of the person's life, but also what they were like at the end. And, so she kinda gets, like, this perspective of how other people lived their life and stuff, and her first, obituary that she has to write is about Monty Williamson, and, she was taken aback, by this man and, like, his life and was very interested and actually becomes friends with his widow, Catherine, who she actually named herself Cricket, and they actually form a very interesting relationship. Cricket, 80 something year old, so she's further along in life, and there's that big age gap. But what did you think of this relationship? Like, I thought it's very, I don't want to say rare, but it's nice to see a healthy female relationship, no matter what age it is. It's just like when women can, like, support each other, I always enjoy that. So what did you think of the Cricket and Nell relationship?
Yeah, I think this is where it's a little bit different than perhaps other stories in this genre. I'm thinking of Remember Finding You. That's the movie title. I forget the book title that we did,
Right.
but that's a young person and an old person, right? The age gap is a little bit different, but similar sort of dynamic in essence. Whereas with this one, while you have that similarity, Cricket is not your typical 80 something year old, right? There's an honesty to her, right, about having lost her husband. But at the same time, she doesn't want to just waste away. She wants to still reinvent herself, much like Nell. And, quite overtly, and not in a negative way, but Nell makes the comparisons between her and Cricket, right? And, quite down even to like, oh, Cricket lost Monty. Well, even though Nell's fiance didn't die, he's not going to be there anymore, right? For the most part.
Right. She still
So,
suffered a loss in some sense.
yeah. So there's that kinship and I think that self-awareness and that presence of Nell to see it, because one of the first things that Cricket says is, I feel lonely. My girlfriend's come and whatever, but they're focused on other stuff and it feels lonely. And Nell's like, well, I feel lonely too. So why don't we, why don't I just start hanging out with you? And that's what starts the whole friendship. And they have many adventures.
Yeah, and I think that's always great because it's usually a lot of times where maybe I'm speaking from experience, but it's definitely a recurring thing with a lot of people who go through loneliness and they feel sad because they're generally doing things by themselves. And then when they find someone else who's kind of like same in the same mental space in different ways, or like there's some thread that makes them similar, like they'll latch onto it. And I think that's where they definitely came together, where they both experienced a loss, but where we think an 80 something year old, or like we think she should be like really sad and depressed and down on life because like what else does she have to look forward to? She's actually the very opposite. She's very energetic. She's still positive. She introduces Nell to crime podcasts and just podcasts in general. And that actually becomes an avenue for Nell to find her own therapeutic project for her to understand her emotions and stuff. So that's where she gets the genesis of the Confessions of a 40 something F up podcast. She wants to do it anonymously. And it's mostly just her recording her stream of conscious and her thoughts of like where she should be in life. Like her friends are different, like all the things that all the milestones she should have hit by now, and she doesn't, and that becomes a therapeutic thing for her. What did you think of the podcast? Because you and I, we both do podcasts. We both understand creative projects that help, like, kind of fuel us in that way. So, what did you think of the podcast part?
Yeah, I think it's like anything where she did it for the right intention, right? Like she didn't ultimately need it to be successful. Um, Obviously, it got successful, but the idea was that it wasn't about that. It was very much about just something for her. And that, not that we necessarily got like that she had to like put out something. She didn't seem to put too much pressure on it. Certainly there was, we'll talk about it in greater length and in a different form, but like when her dad was in the hospital, I'm sure she wasn't worried about the podcast, right? And that's a healthy
Right.
version of that. But it not all the same, it gave her something to look forward to, gave her something to do with like a routine. And that coupled with obviously writing obituaries and things like that, walking Arthur the dog, um, and then cricket, like it started to really build out her life in a certain capacity. And I think that's what she needed, because when she started off, like metaphorically and almost quite literally, she had nothing, right? And now she's got these little building blocks, and so she can, I mean, I use the word building blocks very deliberately because yes,
Mhm.
she can build on that, right? And going back to real quick about cricket, I think one of the things that I appreciate most about the book itself and her relationship with cricket is that I think I see this more so in like 20 and 30-year-olds, but it can apply to anyone. They put so much pressure if they're not in a romantic relationship, then they feel lonely. And it's like you don't need to just have a romantic partner. Like you can look for those deep bonds with through all kinds of people, right? Through friendship
Mhm.
and stuff like that. And so I appreciated that in many ways. I mean, quite literally, cricket is a huge catalyst to get Nell back onto her life. And yes, you know, she does find romance at the end, but it's because she had, as I'm laying out, this foundational stuff of cricket, of the obituaries, of
The dog
Arthur the
walking.
dog, the podcast, and and then she even rekindled her friendship group, you know. So there's so many layers there, and I
Absolutely.
appreciate one final thing. I appreciate the gratitude list, which started off as like this almost like snarky thing where she was like,
Mhm.
oh, books tell you to write gratitude lists and then you'll become more grateful. And she kind of maintained her sarcasm throughout it, but you started to see her mental shift just through those alone and start to see of like, oh, life is getting better. So
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can see like this real time timeline of her being sad and like in this mental space of just like, well, what's the point of living? Hashtag whatever. And then like later on in the book, she's like, hashtag blessed, hashtag I'm glad my dad's not dead, hashtag like I'm looking forward to this and stuff. So like you see this like her getting up like over this hump, and yeah, and like that's a beautiful character progression and character growth that she has throughout this book. I liked how you said it was like building blocks, because I feel like she got to this point where she lost a lot of things. Her life kind of got to, not to say like a dead end, but like a halt. There's always like a big obstacle in her life, and she's like when things just kind of stop, and you're like, oh crap, where do I go from here? And it is the little things like that, walking the dog, having a podcast, having like little things to just get you through your day, and then that gets you to the next day, and that gets you through the month, and that gets you through the year. It's like these little things that you don't think of become a habit and become a way of life. And that in its own way is like its own like CBT therapy in that way. And those little things really did help her keep moving forward in life, because a lot of times where you feel like your life has stopped, those things slowly gave her like baby steps to move forward and make progression, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, certainly, like, and her family was a part of it too, right? Like, her dad helped by giving her a loan. Um, and so there was that sort of ticking time bomb, but and that's why, like, having the job at least helped. It didn't, you know, solve everything, but it was a nice start. That coupled with living with Edward and her ability to save money. Although again, it's almost like pick your poison. Like, which one's more humbling, to live with your
Mhm.
parents at that age or live with a complete stranger and be at that age, and be
Yeah, it
fighting about the thermostat and so forth.
it definitely is pick your poison, and I think that's where character pride and ego also comes along. Is like, how proudful are you? Do you want to like give up your mental health and live with your parents just because you know it's safe, quote unquote, or do you go with the unstable person just because you know you still have a sense of freedom, even though this person Edward has his quirks, like, and like wants no carbon footprint and only uses one toilet paper square per use. It's like what? So it's like what's really worse? Like you said, pick your poison. What didn't you did bring about Edward, and we'll go back to the father too. But what were your thoughts of Edward? Did you really think he was going to become the character as big as an influence in her life that he became, from how he started as the neurotic roommate slash landlord to how he ended up at the end being the love interest?
Yeah, not in that capacity. I mean, I always felt, just by the sheer nature of it, that he was going to have a significant role, and that ultimately, I mean, they're roommates, right? And even early on, they were butting heads and stuff like that. And I thought, that there was going to be some sort of mutual, like, give and take of it all. If, like, oh, she teaches him this, he learns this, but I didn't think it would go to a romantic side. I mean, if anything, our I'm going to call him sod this tennis player. Uh, I thought initially, when it's like, okay, he could be married, I was like, okay, I still, it was like, okay, how is this going to work out? And then it's revealed that it's actually not him. He's just the uncle of the kid. And then they go on dates, and it seems like, okay, I was like, oh, okay. Like, it really was setting it up like he would have been the guy. And then, much like now, the rug was pulled out from underneath me. And I was like, sod him.
Yeah, much like what modern day dating is like, because she got to a point where she was, I don't want to say desperate, but lonely enough where she tried to restart her love life on dating apps, find this guy, Johnny, ends up getting ghosted. Very much like today's modern day dating. And, like you said, rug pulled under her, like she wasn't expecting that. So, yet that's another abrupt loss in her life that she was looking forward to. But with that quick loss with Edward, or sorry, with Johnny, but then her like slow looming relationship with Edward, and how she also realizes that Edward kind of has gone through a loss of love. Like he finally gets to the point where he's not married. Um, and she's like, "Oh, you're not as far along in your love life as I people would think that you are too." So it's like everyone struggles in that sense as well, and I appreciated that.
Yeah, I mean, he had that similarity to her friends where, from the outside looking in, everything's hunky dory, right? Wonderful, except it's not. And I think once those layers started to be shown as more truthful. Um, and that's the beauty of it, is that, again, the friendship side of it happened first, and I think needed to happen first, and then she was able to see Edward for what he ultimately truly was, right?
Yeah,
And then one quick thing, and I think that's also what allowed Nell, um, or sorry, that's what allowed Edward to see himself and let his guard down, was of like, okay, Nell's being honest with me. I've not been honest with her. So let me just, lay my cards down on the table.
right, especially how Edward was introduced, like he didn't even want to admit that their roommate's landlord. It was like, you call me someone else when you have guests over. It was like, we don't know each other. So it's like, even he had his own guards up because he didn't want to admit where he was in life. And I feel like that's very realistic. And a lot of people like always omit a lot of things that they're not proud of out of their life, and for just like false sense of pretense of successfulness. And so like once they finally like took away the lies of who they really are to each other, I think that's where, like you said, the layers were being pulled back. She's like, oh, she was actually starting to see him for who he was. And she was appreciating him more. And it's like, oh no, he's someone who goes through life as well. And he was there for her, didn't even like really ask for it, but he was just like a genuinely good guy who was taking care of her, who was right in front of her for a while, and she just didn't realize. And I think that's where like she was starting to realize the comfort in which she saw it in him as a person, especially someone who was quote unquote lonely. She latched onto that. We brought up a little bit of the friendships, because that kind of like goes along with the Edward, how we find out how Edward's truly single. It's like, so she moved back to London. Nell moved back to London. She rekindles her old friendship with Fiona, who was her best friend, but Fiona now has a new best friend who has integrated herself into this quote unquote friend group, Annabelle, who's more domineering, more possessive, totally not the greatest friend to Nell. And kind of like, what did you think of that dynamic? I thought that was very realistic. I feel like females can get catty and jealous of each other. We're like, no, you're my best friend. We're friends now. You left, and like, I don't like you. So what did you think about Annabelle and how she like mistreated Nell and like purposely left her out of party invitations and stuff like that?
Yeah, like you said, it felt very real. It felt very honest, in that way. And you get we learned that later on, that part of why Annabelle was doing it was because she felt a certain way in her life, right? And it wasn't the picturesque, and she admits, right? Like, the photo by the pool, whatever it took 28 photos or something like that. So, she's
Hmm.
very much posing for this. And I appreciated that arc of her where at the end she's saying, like, I would post these photos so that way I could go on Instagram and look at my life, and maybe I would believe that I have that life. Um, but obviously backtracking to get there, you know, her and Nell very contentious, and to be honest, it's not like her and Fiona's relationship was that great either. I mean, I'm sure it seemed that way, but
Hmm.
neither Fiona nor Annabelle were truly honest with each other. It was just Annabelle represented something cool, and in a way, Fiona was like the person of like, all right, cool. You want to help me make over my house? Let's make over my house. Um,
Right.
Fiona kept remodeling the house because she was looking for a project to do, when in reality, she wanted to restart her career, but was kind of afraid to tell David. Um, and then by the end, they found that. And of course, there's Max and Michelle, where Max loses his job, but he doesn't want to tell Michelle. And that's a dirty secret that, uh, not Fiona, Nell, our protagonist, and Max knows. And, Nell's being very pushy with Max on, like, hey, tell your wife that you essentially don't have a job and you're going out drinking every single day because you're too embarrassed to say anything. And by the way, you have a kid on the way, so like you guys need to figure this out together. So there's a lot of components happening every which way. but I think, some might argue that it's too much or whatever. I think like that's to me is life, right? And that's what Nell's observation of the world is, that it is overwhelming, and how do you deal with all of it? And then
Right.
when all of the friends come together and share the idea that they've been listening to this one podcast and then learn that it's actually been Nell, it really brings them together. If it's like, hey, we're all 40 something fuck ups.
Yeah. And, like, I think that that really opened the door for Nell to be like, "Oh, wait, it's not just me." Like, there is a camaraderie there. It's like, I'm not the only one struggling through this thing called life. We all are, and we all have our insecurities. We all have the things that we only show to the world, quote unquote, like Annabelle showing her more better photos on Instagram, giving the false pretense that she lives this glamorous life where, oh, in real life she's not all that happy. And then so it's like just the finding the similarities is like, oh, you're not happy either if you don't wanted a job, but like she couldn't really get quite there, so she got herself busy with another project. And like how we all distract ourselves from like the things that we are quote unquote lacking in our life, but yet make up for it in other ways that I don't know, find like tries to fill this void and gives us this false sense of fulfillment, or just like a way to keep us busy and distracted. Um, so, like, the little different aspects of where now I was like, "Oh, no, that's me." Okay, so, like, had I been honest and, like, truly, like, not left out my anonymity, like, people wouldn't understand. But that was her whole mentality of starting this podcast. She's like, "If I could just help one person who's understanding this, maybe, like, I'll get some fulfillment out of that." And then when she realized she was helping her own friends through her problems, she's like, "Oh, right. That's the whole point of why I did this." Like, if it resonates with one person, then she did her job.
Yeah. And she did. I mean, that was quite the kumbaya moment for everybody, you know.
Yeah.
And
It
it helped. Like it's very therapeutic. Like no one solved ultimately their problems, but the idea that like again, just the mask came down of Nell was able to see that the people that she idolized and put up on a pedestal had their own complications.
Mhm.
And then once the group realized that that was Nell, they were like, oh, but we look at you as successful, you
Right.
know?
Like,
So,
look at you. You moved across the pond and had a different you had a love life, you had a job, like, you had the bravery to start over somewhere else without people, without family, and they're like, "I couldn't do that." Like, and I know a lot of people who haven't done that. A lot of people see me as the person, I moved from the Midwest out to California, and, like, I don't have any family out here. I have friends that now have my chosen family out here. But it's like it's how people view you. But it's also like that is the unfortunate thing is like if we're just honest with each other, I think we'd actually appreciate each other more. And but because of our insecurities, don't say how proud we are of our friends and their accomplishments. It leaves the people who actually did things feeling like they haven't accomplished anything if you don't have that external validation from people. Um, and that's I think that was something she was missing, but being validated and kind of putting her and her friends on the same mental ground of like, "Oh, we're all in the same space. We're all fuck ups," And, that's where I felt was like, "Yes, that's what I resonate with because 'cause we're all going through this thing called life." Um, a couple things more, like her family, quote unquote, Nell's family, her father goes through an accident, near death experience, but that kind of like really shakes Nell in the like I don't know what you would call it, more existential way of like, oh crap, I almost lost someone and I didn't get to say all the things that I wanted to. What did you think of that aspect?
yeah, I mean, obviously, any experience like that is very sobering for sure. And, as you're sort of reading it, you're like, okay, is this going to turn out okay? Or is there going to be a great lesson to be learned with a tragic ending, that she now has to like overcome that too. Luckily, that's not the case. It's just more of a like, hey, pay attention sort of a lesson, um,
Mhm.
which she does, and I think that's when her gratitude list started becoming much more serious. Like they still had humor in it, right? But they were much deeper. overall in terms of what she was grateful for, and she found that layer um, that she was ultimately searching for, right? Like the ability to gain true happiness lies within what she was starting to finally get to once that happened, you know? And yeah, she was able to appreciate her mom, her dad, her brother, Richie, and stuff like that. And so all those annoyances throughout your whole life, you know, they become a feature, not a bug, as they previously were.
Yeah. And I think that was like one of those eye-opening moments in her life that I feel a lot of people usually get at some point is like when you actually experience like a near trauma that I mean that was kind of emotionally traumatic for her, but like actually getting so close to real death. Yeah, she experienced a loss in her love life and like didn't really get to say all the things she wanted to say with her ex, but like she almost lost her father, a person that she truly loved, like physically, emotionally, mentally, and all of that. Um, and that like really kickstarted her as like, oh, I'm more appreciative of everything that I still do have right now. Um, Rather than the things that she lost, it's like what's in front of me right now. Friends, family, the ability to like still say what she wants to say to who she wants to say it. And yeah, and that like you said that where her gratitude entries were like, "I'm glad he's still alive. I'm glad I still get to have, like, another day with my father," and stuff like that. I I really enjoyed it. That I felt like was a very character growth moment for her, where she was starting to look more positive at things.
And it
Um,
also ignited the same way that she was there for Cricket when Monty passed away. You know, a lot of her friends were there now. Most of them, you know, were more via text message or phone calls, FaceTimes, whatever. And this is that moment that certainly Edward really stepped up and was there. And in that way, Nell really could see herself reflected as Cricket, right? Where, you know, you're in this very vulnerable position, so you need others to uplift you, you know. So in an odd way, it came full circle, minus her having to lose her dad.
right. And, just to go back to Cricket a little bit to round out their relationship, they actually go on a trip to Spain. And it becomes more deeper, more emotionally deeper, and darker, especially the topics of which they call about, and Cricket's loss and, uh, Nell's loss of, miscarriage. And that so it's like there's a whole 'nother layer of loss that she hasn't really faced and processed, and I feel like that brought those 2 even closer. What were your thoughts of the trip to Spain?
Yeah, I mean, you know, talk about layer upon this was like a Inception style,
Yeah.
you know, and I mean, you're already very deep. Just the idea that like, okay, we're gonna take these ashes and we're gonna release them, as it were, and so yeah, you know, that's already emotional enough. But then you get the added layer on that side of it with it's not cheating, right? Because that was a
Mm,
relationship before Cricket, but you know, we learned that like it was a dark secret in the sense that he'd never shared that with Cricket, right? Even though she kind of suspected, and you know, it was a relationship with a man, which you know, you imagine at the certainly at that time would have been like the 1930s, 40s, whatever it was. Like, you know, that's not certainly different times. Let's just put it that way.
right.
Um, so there's that added layer
Excuse me. Oh my goodness.
where Cricket's trying to you know make amends and process all of that and do what's right by inviting the person. And then there's whole you know Nell's processing as you're talking about, and they're able to ultimately come together with Cricket of like, okay, well, I never really wanted kids, but I understand your pain, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and that was something I wasn't really expecting, but also makes sense because fortunately I've never been through a miscarriage, but I know there is a whole community of people out there who don't talk about it because society has I don't know, put the stigma on like the loss of parenthood and the loss of child. It's just like no one wants to talk about it, but unfortunately people do have to talk about it to help process it. And the fact that she didn't process it, and now she's starting to process it now with actually talking and being honest about it with someone else, that is like a new start of healing journey for her,
Yeah. Quick
which really
plug.
helps.
So there's a show that I'm involved in called When Millennials Become Moms, and quite literally the week of this taping, we released an episode that chronicles Natasha, who's the host. This would be her second miscarriage, and one of the questions that, and by the way, she not like live streamed it, but she did live updates on Instagram of it, and you can check those out. And a lot of people ask her like, why the hell would you do that? And she did that specifically, so just people know like the amount of pain, and not just I use people deliberately, so it's not just women,
Mm-hmm.
the pain that is, and overall to, yes, destigmatize it, because sadly it is far more common than we'd like to admit. So
Absolutely. And
so
like,
yeah, for whatever that's
well,
worth, the
well,
podcast is out there, When Millennials Become Moms.
when millennials become moms, I will definitely check that out. Yeah, and even though I personally haven't gone through it, I know other people close to my age or a little bit older than me that have gone through it. So like as you said, it is more common than we think. We know someone within who has gone through it, at least one person. So that became more realistic, and like I felt for her even more. And overall, like I really enjoyed this book because like there were so many aspects I resonated, especially when it came to like career, where you think you should be financially, where you think your friends should be, just like all these milestones and pressures that society puts on us is like, hey, you should have this and this and this by now, especially with the help of social media telling you that you should be having this. It really like tells us that what we're lacking or what we haven't hit yet or what we haven't done yet. And but like everyone's timeline's different. And I always have to remind myself because comparison is the thief of joy. And I admit I'm a 30-something-year-old woman who's never been married, never had kids, never bought a house. Like I get it. I totally get it. But that's not to say I won't ever in some point in my life. But that's just to say, like, maybe eventually I'll get there. Just because I haven't hit that yet doesn't make me a failure. Um, and just with anybody who has wants to acquire things in life and hasn't done it yet, doesn't mean you can't get there. Doesn't mean it won't ever happen. It just means you're on a slower timeline. You're a different timeline than someone else who already has.
Yeah.
So
I have three points about that. Number one, the fact that you haven't, knowing how hard of a worker you are, is a failure of society, not you. Number one, right? So, and that's the hard part, is that, I mean, that's really what it is for a lot of people. It's like you think you do everything correct, and yet you're in this place, and it's like, what the hell do I need to do, right? That's a society thing. Number one. Uh, Number two. Now I'm blanking. It's almost like in Little Rascals. What was number two? Um, uh, I for some reason. Oh, yeah. You're correct in that sense that everyone is on their different timeline, right? I remember during COVID, for artists, right, there was this whole notion that was being pumped through social media of like, see, if if you're not getting ahead now, you never lack time. It's like, okay, the people could be burnt out from everything else. And so who are you to dictate that now all of a sudden, with like all this quote unquote free time, people are supposed to churn out stuff during, what was a traumatic experience, right? I mean, with the pandemic, right?
right,
So it's like, for some people, the best thing they could have done during that time is to just relax and sleep and whatever, right?
take a
And,
much needed break.
yeah, like there is no finish line to any of this. So that's a big component. Um, I had a third thing, but I forgot it. But at least I got two in. So there you
Yeah,
go.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's like everyone's timeline is different. That's all I really can say because I have to in my life, I have to always stop comparing because I mean, for me, it doesn't help that like I have four other siblings. I'm the youngest of five, and like everything I like to think that I've done has already been done by someone else. So it's like everything I do is not original or new. So like that those are the internal wars that I deal with. So I was like, all right, I haven't been married yet, like you have, and you've already been in divorce, like crap like that. It's just like everyone's life is different. And it is really the choices in what we currently do that leads us to the next thing in our life. And we all have different choices and different paths that we could go on. And but the universal theme is that we're all struggling in our own ways. And if we're more honest and talk about it, other people can help you. It's like straight the numbers rather than going through life by yourself.
Yeah, I agree, and that certainly was again the core message of Nell's friendship group, right? That sense of camaraderie that came together, that we are all alike, and they saw in each other what they saw in each other their strengths, while individually they saw only their weaknesses, right? So
Yeah.
to that same effect of like, okay, you're even just because this literally happens in the book, right? So you're analogous to Nell, where you're like, well, I haven't been married, I haven't been this, and it's like the other friends point out to her, yeah, but you didn't settle, you know.
Right.
So
You
and
didn't
it's
settle for a bad relationship or, a bad person.
yeah, I mean, I think it's Edward, right, who makes the joke of like, I've I got married faster than whatever the thing was, and then he's like, maybe that's why my marriage is crap, is because I got married too quick,
Hmm.
you know.
It happens. So overall, I did enjoy this book. I feel like a lot of people should read this, not just women, but also men too, or just like heck, even 20-year-olds, teenagers. Like I think this book can resonate with a lot of different ages, and just because we all go through this thing called life, and it's kind of eye opening. It's like, hey, you're not the only one who struggles. You really aren't.
Yeah.
Okay, so other books that we have read for fun, besides this one, what have you been reading, Phil?
After this, I tried to read Watchmen. Now it's a graphic novel, so yeah, is it reading? Is it not? I don't know. It's always interesting because I don't know how to read comic books.
Right.
Sometimes I just focus on the words and then I'm like, wait, what was even happening with the images? And then sometimes I'll just focus on the images and they'll be like, wait, what are they actually saying? So I don't know. I feel like I'm not the best comic book. I have to like actually condition myself. But the reason I read it was, and I didn't like fully read it. I started diving into it because there was a Zack Snyder movie. Then you turned me on to the animated um, two movies from last year, Watchmen Chapter 1, Watchmen Chapter 2, and none of them
Mm.
have resonated. So I was like, let me go to the source material and see if I like the source material. And I guess I just don't love the source material, if I'm honest. So, but at least in that sense, it was a good confirmation of like, okay, it's just not going to be for me, I don't think. But yeah, March was crazy. So I haven't, beyond that, haven't done too much. More like just simple articles here and there. But yeah, that's it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You and me both. March was definitely crazy. I only read "The Astonishing Color of After" by Emily Can, and that's about a young girl who pretty much she loses her mother, and she gets sent back to, or more so, like her father can't really help process and grieve through this loss, and really sends her back to China to like just like live with her grandparents for a while just to take care of her. And but now she's like learning the Chinese culture of death and like the different aspects of like how they view death, and the reincarnation of like the her mother's spirit is in this bird, and then there's different color aspects of, so that's why it's called The Astonishing Color of After. So it's like really the difference between the American version, American culture, of what we think of like death and depression and loss, compared to like the Chinese depression is like, oh, it can actually be something very positive, very colorful. What does she mean to you? Just because she's gone physically doesn't mean like she's not somewhere else, existing somewhere else. So it's just like it was a really touching, thoughtful, and very emotion provoking. Like, oh right, death isn't always a bad thing either. So I don't know. I'm reading a lot of like heady emotional books lately. Maybe that's where I am in life. But I think that was a good story to deal with, depression and loss as well and grieving. And so upcoming books that we have, Phil, for the April 2025, you chose.
So we're going to do a classic Toni Morrison book. Um, it's one that I haven't read. I've done The Bluest Eye and stuff like that, but the Song of Solomon is argued as one of her best. So I feel like it's time that we just deep dive it. So
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And for May, I chose, maybe this is also just my mentality of where America is in the state of the world. I looked up that 1984 by George Orwell. It is a classic. I've never read it, actually. Have you read it?
I have, yeah,
Okay, great.
but it'll be, it's like no different than revisiting a movie or anything like that. You come into it with a fresh approach, um, for sure, and you know, it's it's very haunting for sure. And I feel like a lot of people quote 1984
Mm,
without actually having read it. You know what I mean? So I
right.
think it'll be interesting for you to not only read the book, but then start to see when people make certain arguments of like, oh, I mean, it happens with the damn Bible. How many people have actually read the Bible, and yet most of them are quoting the damn Bible every single day? Which, by the way, there is a book. I forget what it is, but I saw it, and I think I would love for us to read it at some point. Just depends when, but it's basically um, Jesus and his best friend before the apostles. It's a completely made up story. So it's not, but it's basically like Jesus has a fuck up with his like what almost seems like a buddy cop movie, like they get high sort of a thing
Uh,
novel, you know? So
Before he gets his life in order.
yeah, so it seems very I'm sure sacrilegious to many,
Sacrilegious.
but I don't know. I could go for that kind of humor for sure.
No, that sounds fascinating. We'll have to look that up. Yeah, I've never read 1984, but I figured like I actually looked up because somehow we got like, I don't know, maybe a couple conversations back we got on the conversation that there are a lot of banned books that we've been reading, and I think 1984 is actually like the number one banned book right now in America. So I was like, this is my biggest silent protest as an FU to the country and to the state of the world that we in. I was like, we're gonna read it and we're gonna talk about it. So I think a very, very interesting, another dystopian kind of world, which I think you'll enjoy, which I think I'll probably enjoy as well. So it's just
Have
like
you read
but not too far away from, current reality.
Have you read other Orwell works? Like, I mean, Animal Farm's the other big one.
Actually, no, I haven't, but I'm very familiar with the stories and stuff, and like I know of them. I just haven't read them in depth. And yeah, I think it'll be very telling of how people thought about, well, what they thought of the state of the world back then to how different it is now, or AKA how the same is, or like how history repeats itself. So I think it would just be very interesting for this current us generation reading something that's still pretty
Yeah.
relevant.
Yeah.
So that'll be May.
Okay. Well, there's a certain irony about people wanting to ban it, but then quoting it. So can't wait to talk about that. Yeah. And then, not quite on that same level, but we will be reading book 5 of the Avatar series. So I don't imagine, I mean, you've read other books in that series. They're kind of standalone. So I don't think you need to read books 1 through
Right.
4 to enjoy this one. But we like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Legend of Korra. So if you're a fan of that, this is literally within that world. No different than you have Star Wars not books and things like that that are
Right.
part of the lore of the movies.
Yeah, and I love that world, Avatarverse, Legend of Korra. I mean, like, all my artwork in my apartment's Legend of Korra. So, like, I am really excited. You said they are standalone. It's about, each different avatar, but it's just really the placement of the timeline of where they are in the avatar cycle. So, like, you can read about each, and it will ultimately make sense if you did read them in order, but that's not to say that you can't understand it by itself. So I'm really excited about Roku because he's the one who's right before Aang. So he's very close to the current timeline that we all know and was introduced to within this world. So that should be very exciting for us. Um, and I don't have a choice for July, but we will when we get there.
Oh yes. One final book recommendation. I tried to get my hands on it this week. It's called True and False Magic, written by Phil Stutz and Elise Lunan. They were all sold out at every Barnes and Noble I went to. So
Ooh.
yay for them, boo for us. But keep at it. It's a nonfiction book. It's kind of like a workbook, but not a workbook. And it's tough to describe, and also because I don't have it, I can't quite like showcase it in that way. But it's Phil Stutz is he's a therapist, very highly regarded, especially for creatives and high-minded creatives. So he's able to like unlock them, and this just takes his knowledge to a whole new level with actual exercises. So
Oh, it's actually, what
it's
is it?
like,
More like engaging
yeah,
kind
it's
of.
not meant to be read in one sitting. Like it's meant to be
Okay.
processed and engaged with over time. I mean, it's only literally 100 pages.
I see. That kind of reminds me of The Artist's Way. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
with
it's
more.
very, like,
Yeah,
immersive and, like, doing actual, like, skill building, like, and actually, going through the motions of creating things and
yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah.
So,
Julia Cameron with the morning pages. She's wonderful. So highly recommend The
yeah.
Artist's Way for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And highly recommend these books that we're reading, have read, will read. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Phil, where can everyone follow you?
I'm at Phil Svitek. Pretty simple.
Yep, and I'm at Serafini TV. Thanks for joining us for Confessions of a 40-something F up, and we will see you for our next book.